Okay, in this recording, we continue our discussion of the transport revolution, primarily in the UK. Um, as you can see here, we need to talk about canals. So, canals used to be used as one of the main ways of transporting goods, okay, because it was cheap. So, if you were producing coal and iron and you had to bring these goods to another place. So this would be your, I suppose, your best option because it was cheap. There was a canal system in the UK, and then it a barge. This is a barge. This would allow you to carry quite, you know, a big amount of goods compared to, for instance, using carriages that were pulled by horses. So, for instance, as an example of a canal system that was really important at this time in the 19th century was the Bridgewater Canal. So, this, thanks to this, people were able to bring coal from the fields to Manchester. This was built by James Brindley, this canal system. So by 1830, almost the mid 19th century, about 6,500 kilometers of canals were built. Okay, the the main that's not a lot compared to roads. Okay, and another thing is that it was relatively slow. Eventually, later in the mid 19th century, railways would overtake canals in importance, as you will see. Um, just to give you an example, so this is another canal. This is the part of the Bridgewater Canal was from Lancashire, from Worsley to Manchester, for instance, just to give you a geographical sense of the places we're talking about. So Lancashire is there, Manchester. So we're talking about this part of Britain. Okay, so I hope that's clear. And then eventually, you would have the railway system developed. Remember the invention of the steam engine that would pave the way for the steam locomotive. So the kind of machine, the kind of engine that would be adapted for the railway system. So it was Richard Trevithick, who adapted the steam engine for use on rails. So he was able to use this technology and produce the steam locomotive, and this kind of machine would run on an iron track. At first, train tracks, railways were used for industrial purposes, mainly for transporting goods. So his steam locomotive was able to, at least initially, transport 9 tons of ore and then about 70 people at about 8 kilometers per hour. You would think nowadays there's nothing 8 kilometers per hour. I mean, you might be going on a bike might be faster than this. At any rate, eventually trains would go faster, and this was really a new experience for people. Why? Because nowadays, if you're on a train, you look out the window, and scenes, scenery, or the things that you see outside, we just go past them very quickly. Now imagine that people started to be on trains, to travel by train, and they had a similar experience. For them, this was fast. Okay, and then George Stephenson is important because he built the first train that carried goods. Um, so at first it only ran between Stockton and Darlington. So it's here, Stockton, Darlington. And then later on, Stephenson would develop Rocket, which was the first public railway line. It ran between Manchester and Liverpool. Okay, so let's see here, just to give you an idea, Liverpool, Manchester. Okay, Liverpool, Manchester. So, like I said, at first, the trains were built for industrial purposes, just transporting raw materials, and then eventually they were used to carry goods, finished goods, and then later on they began to be used for public transport. As you can see here, just to give you an idea of really the growth of the railway system in a matter of 20 years, you see the exponential increase in you know in terms of tracks built in Britain. So the development of the railway system had important, I mean, really significant effects. It made transport cheaper and faster. And if you're talking about industry, so it became possible to transport heavy goods over longer distances. And you can imagine this was a great help to the heavy industries of mining, iron, and steel. And then later on, when trains began to be used for by the public, so this also helped improve tourism. I mean, to promote tourism, because people could leave their towns, their cities, and go to resort towns like Bath, for instance, or coastal towns like Brighton. So they could take some time off. This also made possible the delivery of fresh produce to cities. Of course, obviously, it created jobs. And then, you know, um, this led to a decline in the use of roads and canals. Okay, not that roads would become less significant, but just, more and more people and more industries started to use, you know, the railway system. And then you also have the development of steamships. You see, as you can see here, until the 18th century, ships were wind powered. They had sails and they had to rely on, wind energy. Now, by the late 18th centuries, the steam engine for ships was invented, but it wouldn't be successfully adapted or used until the 19th century. Okay, so you have an American, Robert Fulton, who first invented the paddle boat, the steam paddle boat. As you can see here, it's a because of the you can see from the smoke that's coming out of this tube here that this is a steam engine, but at the same time it's also a paddle boat, as you can see from this this thing on the side of the ship. So he built that in 1807, and by 1819, there was this successful crossing of the Atlantic for the first time by a steamship. At first, this steamships took a long time to get from one point to another to cross the Atlantic. It took 6 weeks, but in a matter of um, about half a century, 50 years, you know, that travel time was cut down to 10 days. Quite an improvement if you think about it. So, what were the effects of the transport revolution in general? All of these things that we talked about. So, the road system, canals, the invention of locomotives, steam locomotives, and then steamships. In general, they made transport quicker, cheaper, transport of goods and raw materials. Um, it, transport became more efficient, so it took less time to carry goods from one point to another, from where they were produced to the marketplace. And of course, another positive effect of this was if you were more efficient, you could lower your prices. So imagine more goods were accessible to more people at lower prices. Like I said, cheaper goods, more access. And, from the point of view of, I mean, talking about this within the context of the Industrial Revolution, this really boosted, you know, the heavy industries. So this led to the increase of the production of iron, steel, and coal, because it became easier to transport them. When that happens, you would also have an increase in demand, and you know these industries had to produce more. Okay, so now we're done talking about the transport revolution. In the next recordings, we'll discuss the conditions in factories and in the living quarters of these 19th century, early 20th century workers. Okay, I'll see you in our next classes.